weird ancient Rome rules that existed for really good reasons. If you walked through the streets of ancient Rome for a single day, you might think you'd stepped into a world full of strange, overly strict, sometimes even bizarre rules. Men wearing togas in very specific ways, laws about funerals, restrictions on luxury, curfews for chariots, even rules about how much you were allowed to cry at a funeral. At first glance, many of these laws seem weird, but when you look closer, almost every strange Roman rule had a surprisingly practical reason behind it. Ancient Rome wasn't just a city. It was a massive, noisy, crowded superpower that at its peak ruled millions of people across 3 continents. Keeping order in such a huge and diverse society required creativity, and sometimes creativity looks strange from the outside. So today, let's walk through some of the weirdest rules in ancient Rome and uncover the very good reasons they actually existed. One of the strangest Roman laws to modern eyes was the rule restricting luxury clothing and jewelry. These were known as sumptuary laws, and one of the most famous was the Lex Oppia, passed during the Second Punic War. The law limited how much gold a woman could wear. It restricted brightly colored garments. It even limited the use of carriages inside the city. At first it sounds unfair and controlling, and in some ways it absolutely was. But the reason behind it wasn't random cruelty. Rome was fighting for survival against Carthage under Hannibal. The war was expensive beyond imagination. Resources were scarce. Gold was needed for the state, not for fashion. The government wanted to prevent displays of wealth while soldiers were dying and taxes were rising. It was also about social tension. Rome was deeply divided between rich elites and struggling commoners. Flashy displays of wealth during wartime could spark resentment, riots, or political instability. So yes, limiting jewelry sounds strange, but during an existential war, it was damage control. Interestingly, when the war ended, Roman women protested in the streets to repeal the law. One of the earliest recorded examples of organized female political action in Roman history. Another strange rule involved funerals. The Romans strictly regulated how funerals were conducted. The famous 12 Tables, Rome's earliest written laws, limited excessive mourning. Women were forbidden from tearing their cheeks or making dramatic displays of grief. There were restrictions on how lavish tombs could be. Why would Rome care about how loudly someone cried? Because funerals were political. In Roman society, elite families used funerals to display power. They paraded wax masks of ancestors. They delivered grand speeches praising their lineage. They hired professional mourners to amplify the spectacle. It became a competition. Excessive funerals created social pressure and financial strain. Poor families might bankrupt themselves trying to imitate aristocratic displays. Public order could also be disrupted by large, emotional crowds. So Rome stepped in and said, grief is allowed, but spectacle has limits. The rule wasn't about suppressing emotion, it was about preventing social chaos and economic self-destruction. Then there was the ban on burials inside the city. Romans were forbidden from burying or cremating bodies within Rome's sacred boundary, known as the Pomerium. At first glance, this seems like superstition, but it was incredibly practical. Ancient cities were crowded and lacked modern sanitation. Decomposing bodies could spread disease. Cremation smoke in dense urban areas could cause fires and air problems. By forcing burials outside city limits, Rome protected public health and reduced fire risk. It also created the famous Roman roads lined with tombs, turning remembrance into a visible part of daily life. A strange boundary rule? Yes. A smart urban health policy? Absolutely. One of the most unusual Roman rules was the restriction on nighttime chariot traffic. During the height of the empire, chariots and wheeled vehicles were largely banned from operating during the day in central Rome. Only at night could goods be transported. Why? Because Rome was loud and congested. Imagine a city of over 1 million people with narrow streets, no traffic lights, no asphalt, and constant construction. Daytime chariot traffic would create gridlock. By restricting heavy transport to nighttime, Rome reduced daytime congestion for pedestrians and commerce. Of course, this meant nights were noisy. Roman writers complained about sleepless nights from rumbling carts, but the alternative was complete daytime paralysis. In a way, Rome invented an early version of traffic regulation centuries before modern cities did the same. Now let's talk about something that sounds absurd. The Roman rule about wearing a toga. The toga was not just clothing, it was citizenship made visible. Roman male citizens were required to wear the toga in formal public settings. Foreigners, slaves, and certain social classes were forbidden from wearing it. Why so strict about fabric? Because Rome was obsessed with identity. The empire included people from Spain to Syria, North Africa to Britain. Ethnic diversity was enormous. The toga functioned as a visual symbol of Roman citizenship and civic belonging. In a world without ID cards or digital databases, clothing was documentation. You could tell someone's status at a glance. It reinforced hierarchy. It prevented impersonation. It created unity among citizens. Yes, it seems theatrical, but it was a social security system made of cloth. Another strange regulation involved naming conventions. Roman names followed a strict pattern: praenomen, nomen, and cognomen. Why did this matter? Because Rome needed a way to track lineage, inheritance, and political alliances. Family identity was central to Roman power. Your name connected you to a clan. That clan determined social capital. In a republic where elections were influenced by reputation and ancestry, names were not casual. They were political assets. Standardized naming reduced confusion in legal contracts and public records. It was bureaucratic efficiency in a society that valued order above all. Perhaps one of the most shocking Roman laws involved paternal authority. Under patria potestas, the male head of household had legal power over his children, even adult sons. He could approve marriages, manage property, and, in early Rome, even decide life or death in extreme cases. It sounds horrifying. But again, context matters. Roman society was built around the household as the primary unit of stability. The state depended on strong, unified families to maintain order, property continuity, and military recruitment. Giving ultimate authority to one patriarch created clarity in inheritance disputes and economic management. Was it harsh? Yes. Was it designed to prevent fragmentation of property and political power? Also yes. Over time, these powers were reduced as society evolved. Let's look at something surprisingly modern: building codes. After devastating fires, especially the Great Fire during the reign of Nero, Rome introduced regulations on building materials and street width. Buildings had to use more fire-resistant materials like stone. Streets were widened. Height limits were imposed. Before these laws, Rome was a maze of wooden apartment blocks packed tightly together. Fire could spread uncontrollably. The new regulations weren't aesthetic choices. They were urban survival strategies. The Great Fire forced Rome to rethink city planning, centuries before modern zoning laws. Another rule that seems odd today: soldiers were not allowed to marry during certain periods of the empire. Why forbid marriage? Because Roman soldiers were expected to be mobile and fully committed to military life. Families created divided loyalties. If stationed in distant provinces, a soldier with a local family might resist relocation or feel torn between duty and domestic life. The ban ensured discipline and flexibility. Eventually, the rules softened. But at its core, it was about maintaining military efficiency in a vast empire constantly at war. There were also laws regulating how much you could spend on dinner parties. Again, sumptuary law. Romans feared moral decay from luxury. Lavish feasts symbolized corruption and loss of traditional virtues like discipline and simplicity. By limiting expenditures on banquets, lawmakers tried to preserve social balance and discourage reckless spending. Did it always work? Not really. But the intention reveals something fascinating. Rome believed that excess luxury could weaken the state. In their view, moral strength and military strength were connected. One particularly strange-sounding rule involved the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses were required to maintain chastity for 30 years while tending the sacred fire of Rome. If a Vestal broke her vow, she faced severe punishment, famously being buried alive. Why such extreme measures? Because the Vestals symbolized Rome's divine protection. The sacred fire represented the life of the city itself. In Roman belief, if the fire went out or the vow was broken, the god's favor might be withdrawn. This wasn't merely religious superstition. Religion and state were inseparable in Rome. Maintaining ritual purity was seen as national security. Even voting procedures had strange rules. Citizens voted in assemblies grouped by centuries and tribes, not simply by individual headcount. Why such complexity? Because Rome balanced aristocratic influence with popular participation. The system gave structured order to mass voting, reducing chaos and ensuring elite voices remained influential. It was not pure democracy. It was controlled participation. Complicated? Yes. But it prevented mob rule while still allowing civic involvement. Roman slaves, too, were governed by strict identification rules. In some periods, slaves were forbidden from wearing certain clothing that resembled citizen attire. Why? Because slaves vastly outnumbered citizens in some regions. If they dressed identically, it might blur social boundaries and encourage rebellion. Clear visual distinctions reinforced hierarchy and discouraged collective organization. Harsh but calculated. Even something as mundane as water usage was regulated. Public fountains and aqueduct systems were carefully monitored. Diverting water illegally was punishable. Water was life in a massive city. Aqueducts required maintenance and protection from sabotage or theft. Strict laws ensured fair distribution and preserved infrastructure. Without water control, Rome could collapse in weeks. There were also rules about public behavior. Men could not wear certain colors associated with triumph unless they had earned the honor. The color purple, especially Tyrian purple, was tightly restricted. Purple dye was extremely expensive and symbolized authority. Limiting its use preserved the visual power of leadership. If everyone wore purple, it meant nothing. Control of symbols equals control of perception. Even the famous gladiatorial game had strict regulations. Though brutal, they were structured events. Contracts protected some gladiators' financial interests. Schedules were regulated. Seating arrangements reinforced class hierarchy. The games weren't random bloodshed. They were controlled spectacles designed to reinforce Roman values of courage, endurance, and dominance. When you step back, a pattern emerges. Nearly every weird Roman rule connects to one of four things: public order, public health, social hierarchy, state survival. Ancient Rome lasted for centuries, not because it was chaotic, but because it was obsessively regulated. From funerals to fashion, from traffic to religion, from names to dinner parties, the Romans believed structure created stability. And in many cases, they were right. What seems bizarre now was often brilliant in context. The toga wasn't just clothing. Funeral limits weren't emotional suppression. Chariot bans weren't arbitrary. Marriage restrictions weren't anti-love. They were tools. Sometimes harsh, sometimes controlling. But tools designed to hold together one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. Rome understood something powerful. Small rules prevent big disasters. And that may be the strangest truth of all, because when we laugh at ancient laws, we often forget. Modern society is full of weird rules too. Building codes, traffic laws, tax regulations, dress codes, health inspections. Centuries from now, people might look at our regulations and ask the same question. Why on earth did they do that? And the answer will probably be the same one the Romans would give. Because without rules, cities burn, societies fracture, empires fall. And Rome, for all its strangeness, understood that better than almost anyone. Let's continue walking deeper into the strange world of ancient Rome, a place where even your personal life, your home, your relationships, and sometimes even your thoughts were quietly shaped by rules that, at first glance, seem incredibly intrusive, but in reality were designed to keep an enormous empire from tearing itself apart. One of the strangest Roman rules involved something very personal, whether you were allowed to remain single. Yes, in ancient Rome, being unmarried could actually be illegal, or at least punished. During the reign of Augustus, laws were introduced that penalized unmarried adults. These were called the Lex Julia and Lex Papia Poppaea. Under these laws, men between certain ages were expected to marry. Women, too, were encouraged, and sometimes pressured, to have children. If you remained unmarried, you could lose inheritance rights. You might be excluded from receiving property left to you in wills. In some cases, unmarried citizens faced financial disadvantages compared to those with families. Why would the state care so much about your love life? Because Rome was facing a population crisis, especially among its upper classes. Elite Roman families were having fewer children. Many were focused on wealth, politics, and luxury instead of raising families. This created a long-term threat. Rome depended on future citizens to become soldiers, administrators, and leaders. Without enough children, the empire's future would weaken. Augustus understood something fundamental. Empires don't collapse only from invasion. They collapse from demographic decline. So he used the law to push people toward marriage and reproduction. It wasn't about romance, it was about survival. Rome needed citizens the way an army needs recruits. Another strange Roman rule involved where powerful generals were allowed to go, and, more importantly, where they were forbidden from going. Roman generals were not allowed to enter the city of Rome with their armies. This rule existed because Rome had experienced the terrifying danger of military coups. A successful general commanded enormous loyalty from his troops. Soldiers who fought and bled under a commander often trusted him more than the government itself. If generals could freely march their armies into the city, they could seize power at any moment. So Rome created a sacred boundary called the Pomerium. Inside this boundary, military authority was forbidden. A general had to dismiss or leave behind his army before entering. This rule was meant to protect the Republic from military dictatorship. And for centuries, it worked. Until one man broke it. That man was Julius Caesar. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army in 49 BCE, he violated the sacred rule. It was an act of rebellion that triggered a civil war and ultimately ended the Roman Republic. That single act proved exactly why the rule had existed in the first place. It wasn't paranoia. It was protection against tyranny. There was also a strange Roman rule about where different social classes could sit during public events. In theaters and arenas, seating wasn't first come, first served. Your seat was determined by your social rank. Senators sat closest to the action. Wealthy citizens sat behind them. Ordinary citizens sat farther back. Women often sat in separate sections. Slaves in the lowest classes sat in the worst areas. Why such strict seating arrangements? Because public gatherings involved tens of thousands of people. Without clear structure, chaos could erupt. More importantly, Rome was obsessed with hierarchy. Social order was the foundation of Roman identity. Public seating visually reinforced the structure of society. Everyone could see their place. Everyone could see everyone else's place. This prevented disputes, reduced confusion, and reinforced stability. It constantly reminded citizens that Rome was not a society of equals, but a society of order. One of the most unusual Roman positions was that of the censor. The censor wasn't just someone who counted citizens. They were moral guardians. Censors could punish citizens for immoral behavior. They could remove senators from office. They could downgrade someone's social status for dishonorable conduct. One famous censor was Cato the Elder, who became known for his strict enforcement of traditional Roman values. He targeted luxury, excess, and moral decay. Why did Rome give officials the power to judge morality? Because Romans believed moral weakness led to national weakness. They saw discipline as the backbone of their success. If citizens became soft, selfish, or indulgent, Rome itself would weaken. The censor existed to prevent that. It wasn't just about controlling people. It was about preserving the character that had built the empire. There were even rules about how tall buildings could be. Ancient Rome had something like modern apartment buildings called insulae. These structures could house dozens of families stacked on top of each other. But many were poorly built. They collapsed. They burned easily. They killed people. So the government introduced height limits. This reduced structural stress and lowered the risk of collapse. It also made firefighting easier. This might sound like common sense now, but at the time it was revolutionary. Rome was inventing urban safety regulations thousands of years before modern building codes. Another strange Roman rule involved suicide. In certain cases, suicide was illegal, especially for soldiers. If a soldier killed himself without permission, his family could lose inheritance rights. Why? Because soldiers belonged to the state. Their service was an obligation. Their lives were considered assets in Rome's military system. Suicide meant abandoning duty. Rome couldn't afford soldiers choosing death instead of service. However, in some cases, people were allowed, even encouraged, to take their own lives with dignity, especially to avoid disgrace. This wasn't about compassion. It was about control. Even death was regulated. Romans also had strict rules about patron-client relationships. Every morning, lower-status citizens would visit their wealthy patrons in a ritual called the salutatio. Clients showed respect. Patrons provided protection, money, or opportunities. This wasn't optional. It was a social obligation. Why did this exist? Because Rome didn't have modern welfare systems. This network created a structured support system. The poor gained protection. The rich gained loyalty and influence. It tied society together through mutual dependence. Without this system, inequality might have exploded into unrest. Instead, it was managed through personal bonds. Another strange rule involved purple clothing. Purple dye, especially Tyrian purple, was incredibly rare and expensive. Eventually, its use became restricted almost exclusively to emperors. Why? Because symbols matter. When people saw purple, they immediately associated it with authority. It created instant recognition. If anyone could wear it, that symbolic power would disappear. Rome understood branding long before modern corporations existed. Authority wasn't just enforced, it was displayed. There was even a strange rule about urination. Public urinals in Rome were taxed. This tax was introduced by Emperor Vespasian. Why tax urine? Because urine had economic value. It was used in tanning leather. It was used in cleaning clothes. Fullers, workers who cleaned garments, relied on it. By taxing its collection, the state generated revenue. When people criticized the tax, Vespasian reportedly held up a coin and asked whether it smelled. Money, he argued, had no smell. The lesson was clear. Rome taxed everything useful. Nothing was too strange if it strengthened the state. Romans also had rules about mourning periods. Widows were required to wait a certain period before remarrying. Why? To prevent confusion about paternity. If a widow remarried immediately and became pregnant, it could be unclear whether the child belonged to the first husband or the second. This created inheritance disputes. By enforcing waiting periods, Rome protected legal clarity. Even grief had legal structure. There were rules about exposing infants. This is one of the darkest realities of Roman life. Fathers had legal authority to accept or reject newborn children. If a child was rejected, it could be abandoned. Why allow this? Because Rome lacked modern welfare. Families needed to ensure they could support children. While tragic, this system was connected to economic survival in a harsh world. It also reflected the absolute authority of the father in Roman society. Over time, attitudes slowly shifted. But in early Rome, survival came before sentiment. Another strange rule involved triumphs, the grand victory parades for successful generals. A general could not simply declare his own triumph. It had to be approved by the Senate. Why? Because triumphs brought enormous prestige. They could elevate a general's popularity to dangerous levels. Rome feared powerful individuals gaining too much influence. By controlling triumphs, the Senate controlled ambition. It prevented heroes from becoming kings, at least for a while. Even fire brigades were regulated carefully. After major fires, Rome created organized firefighting forces. These weren't just firefighters. They were also security forces. They prevented arson, controlled crowds, and enforced safety rules. Fire wasn't just a natural threat. It was a political threat. Large fires could destroy neighborhoods, displace thousands, and destabilize the city. Fire control was empire control. By now, you can see the pattern more clearly than ever. Ancient Rome wasn't just powerful because of its army. It was powerful because of its rules. Rules about marriage ensured future citizens. Rules about generals prevented military takeovers. Rules about seating prevented public disorder. Rules about morality preserved discipline. Rules about buildings prevented disaster. Rules about clothing reinforced authority. Rules about mourning protected inheritance. Rules about symbols preserved identity. Rules about urine generated revenue. Nothing was random. Everything served stability. Rome understood that managing millions of people required structure at every level, from the battlefield to the bedroom. And while many of these rules seem strange today, they reveal something deeply human. Every society, ancient or modern, creates rules to solve its biggest fears. Fear of chaos, fear of collapse, fear of losing control. Rome's rules were its defense against those fears. And for centuries they worked. Because in the end, Rome wasn't held together by stone walls or iron swords. It was held together by rules. And those rules shaped one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. Now let's go even deeper, into the kinds of Roman rules that feel almost unbelievable today, yet reveal just how carefully engineered Roman society really was. Because ancient Rome didn't just regulate politics, marriage, or buildings. It regulated ambition. It regulated power. It even regulated time itself. One of the strangest systems in Roman political life was the cursus honorum, the course of offices. If a man wanted to climb the political ladder, he couldn't simply run for the highest position. He had to follow a strict sequence. First quaestor, then aedile or tribune, then praetor, finally consul. There were minimum age requirements, mandatory waiting periods between offices, rules about how often someone could serve. Why make politics so complicated? Because Rome feared concentration of power. The Republic had overthrown kings centuries earlier. The memory of monarchy haunted Roman politics. The cursus honorum slowed ambition down. It forced aspiring leaders to prove themselves gradually. It prevented young, charismatic figures from suddenly seizing control. In theory, it created experienced leadership. In practice, it delayed, but did not always stop dangerous men from rising. Still, for centuries, it provided structure in a system where popularity could easily turn into dictatorship. Another strange rule: Roman magistrates could veto each other. 2 consuls were elected each year, not one. Why? Because Rome didn't trust single leadership. Each consul could block the other's decisions. This sounds inefficient, but it was intentional inefficiency. The Romans preferred slow government to tyrannical government. Power divided was power controlled. It made decision-making frustrating at times, but it prevented one man from acting without resistance. This deep suspicion of concentrated authority shaped nearly every Roman institution. Let's talk about something deeply personal: adultery. Under the reforms of Augustus, adultery became a public crime. Not just a private scandal. A crime against the state. Why? Because Augustus wanted to restore what he called traditional Roman morality. He believed family breakdown weakened society. If elite families became unstable, inheritance, alliances, and political continuity would suffer. By criminalizing adultery, Augustus wasn't just policing behavior. He was reinforcing the idea that family stability was a public concern. In Rome, private life was never fully private. Everything connected back to the strength of the state. Another bizarre-sounding rule involved slaves and testimony. Roman slaves could not testify in court unless they were tortured. Yes, tortured. To modern ears, this is horrifying. But the Roman logic was based on their belief that slaves were loyal to their masters and would lie to protect them. They believed pain would force truth. This reflects not just cruelty, but a system built on deep distrust. Slavery was foundational to Roman society. Millions of enslaved people lived within the empire. The state constantly feared conspiracy and rebellion. By controlling testimony through torture, the Romans believed they reduced false statements. It was brutal, but it was rooted in maintaining legal authority in a slave-based economy. Now let's look at something surprising: Roman calendars. Before reforms, Roman months were manipulated by politicians. Magistrates could extend or shorten months to prolong their time in office or shorten rivals' terms. Yes, time itself could be politically altered. This created chaos. So in 46 BCE, Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar. It standardized the year to 365 days with leap years. Why was this necessary? Because administrative stability requires predictable time. Taxes, military campaigns, harvests, everything depends on the calendar. Fixing time wasn't cosmetic. It was administrative survival. Without accurate calendars, the empire couldn't function efficiently. There were also strict rules about citizenship. Becoming a Roman citizen wasn't automatic. It could be earned through military service granted as a reward or inherited. But it came with responsibilities, taxes, military duty, civic obligations. Rome expanded citizenship carefully. Why? Because citizenship created loyalty. When conquered peoples were eventually granted citizenship, they gained legal rights and a stake in Rome's success. Instead of ruling only by fear, Rome ruled by inclusion. Strategically, this helped prevent constant rebellion. Citizenship was one of Rome's smartest tools. It transformed enemies into participants. Another strange rule involved debt bondage. In early Rome, if someone couldn't repay debt, they could become a form of bonded servant to their creditor. This seems extreme. But Rome didn't have modern banking systems. Credit was personal. Loans were tied to honor and reputation. Harsh debt laws created accountability. At the same time, excessive abuse of debt bondage caused social unrest. Eventually, reforms limited its severity. A lesson? Rome constantly adjusted its rules to balance economic order with social stability. There were even regulations about how much land individuals could own. At different times, laws attempted to limit large land holdings. Why? Because massive estates owned by elites were pushing small farmers off their land. Those small farmers were the backbone of the Roman army. If they disappeared, Rome lost soldiers. Land reform wasn't just about fairness. It was about military survival. When reformers like Tiberius Gracchus tried to enforce land redistribution, it triggered political violence. His assassination revealed something important. Even good-intentioned rules can destabilize society if power structures resist them. Let's move to something surprisingly modern: consumer protection. Roman markets were regulated. Aedila, public officials, inspected goods. They ensured weights and measures were accurate. They could fine sellers for fraud. Why? Because in a city of over 1 million people, trust in markets was essential. If buyers constantly felt cheated, riots could erupt. Food supply was especially sensitive. Rome even had grain distribution programs to prevent famine and unrest. Food security equals political stability. The Romans understood this deeply. Another fascinating rule involved public speaking. In the Roman Republic, political speeches were central to civic life. But there were strict rules about where and when assemblies could occur. Why regulate speech locations? Because crowds could become mobs. Rome had experienced riots. By controlling assembly spaces, officials could monitor and manage public gatherings. Free speech existed, but within structured limits. Again, the priority was order. Let's talk about exile. Instead of executing political enemies, Rome often used exile. Why? Because exile removed a threat without creating a martyr. Execution could inspire revenge. Exile weakened influence quietly. It was strategic punishment. Remove the problem without inflaming the public. Practical, calculated, effective. There were even rules about triumphal clothing. When a victorious general celebrated a triumph, he wore a purple and gold toga, but only for that event. Afterward, he returned to ordinary status. Why limit the display? Because permanent symbols of superiority threatened Republican values. The temporary nature of triumph reinforced that no man was above the state, at least in theory. Even religion was regulated tightly. Foreign cults were sometimes banned if they were seen as politically destabilizing. Why interfere with worship? Because religion in Rome wasn't just spiritual. It was political. Secret gatherings, especially large ones, could become centers of rebellion. When certain cults grew too independent, the Senate intervened. Control religion, control loyalty. And here's something particularly strange. During certain festivals, normal laws were temporarily suspended. Take Saturnalia, for example. During this festival, social roles reversed. Slaves dined with masters. Formality relaxed. Gambling was allowed. Why allow temporary chaos? Because controlled release prevents explosion. By allowing a short period of social relaxation, Rome reduced long-term resentment. It was psychological pressure relief built into the calendar, a brilliant social safety valve. If you step back now, the picture becomes even clearer. Ancient Rome was not just a military machine. It was a rule-making machine. It regulated ambition. It regulated morality. It regulated time. It regulated identity. It regulated class. It regulated economy. It regulated religion. Every strange law was a response to a specific fear. Fear of tyranny. Fear of chaos. Fear of economic collapse. Fear of rebellion. Fear of moral decay. And perhaps most importantly, fear of losing control over a vast and fragile empire. The reason Rome lasted as long as it did wasn't just because of legions and conquest. It lasted because it understood that civilization is fragile. And fragile things require structure. The strange part isn't that Rome had weird rules. The strange part is how many of them make perfect sense once you understand the problem they were solving. Now we move even deeper into the machinery of Roman control, into rules that governed fear, reputation, spectacle, and even the invisible lines between freedom and authority. Because by this point, one thing should be clear. Ancient Rome did not leave stability to chance. It engineered it. And sometimes that engineering looked incredibly strange. Let's begin with something that feels surprisingly modern. Surveillance. Rome did not have cameras or digital tracking, but it had something just as powerful, reputation law. Discitor. One of the harshest punishments in Roman society was something called infamia. If a citizen was declared infamous, they didn't necessarily go to prison. Instead, they lost social credibility. They could be barred from holding office. They might lose legal privileges. Their testimony in court could carry less weight. Who could be labeled infamous? Actors, gladiators, certain criminals, dishonorable businessmen, even people convicted of specific moral crimes. Why create a punishment based on reputation? Because Roman society ran on honor. Political careers, business contracts, marriages, everything depended on public trust. By threatening reputation, the state created social self-policing. You didn't just fear prison, you feared humiliation. And in a culture obsessed with dignity, that was powerful control. Another strange Roman rule involved elections, specifically bribery. Roman elections were extremely competitive. Candidates hosted games, distributed gifts, gave speeches, tried to win public favor. Bribery became common. So Rome created detailed anti-bribery laws, known as ambitus laws. Candidates were limited in how much they could spend. They could not directly hand out money for votes. In some periods, penalties included exile. Why such strict regulation? Because Rome understood that if elections became openly corrupt, legitimacy would collapse. Citizens needed to believe the system had fairness. Even if corruption never fully disappeared, the laws existed to signal that the Republic valued integrity. The image of fairness was as important as fairness itself. Let's talk about something darker. Damnatio memoria. In some cases, when an emperor or official was deemed a traitor or tyrant, the Senate could condemn his memory. His statues were destroyed. His name was erased from inscriptions. His face was chiseled off monuments. It was as if he had never existed. Why erase someone from history? Because memory equals influence. If a disgraced leader remained honored in stone, his legacy could inspire rebellion or sympathy. By removing his image, Rome tried to control historical narrative. It was ancient information control, a brutal reminder that even memory was political. Another strange regulation involved clothing for mourning. Roman widows were expected to wear specific garments and avoid certain colors during mourning periods. Why regulate grief visually? Because in Rome, clothing communicated status and circumstance. Mourning attire publicly signaled loss. This wasn't just emotional expression. It informed the community. It prevented inappropriate celebrations. It allowed society to adjust behavior around the grieving household. Visual communication reduced social awkwardness and misunderstanding. Even sorrow had structure. Now consider military discipline. Roman soldiers faced decimation, a terrifying punishment. If a unit showed cowardice or mutiny, 1 in 10 soldiers could be executed by their own comrades. It sounds unbelievably harsh. Why such severity? Because Roman armies relied on collective discipline. If fear spread through a unit, entire campaigns could fail. Decimation wasn't common, but its possibility created psychological deterrence. The message was clear. Your survival depends on loyalty to the group. Extreme? Absolutely. Effective? Often. The Roman army became one of the most disciplined forces in history. There were also strict rules about roads. Roman roads were engineered with precision. But beyond construction, there were regulations about maintenance and public use. Property owners near roads were sometimes responsible for upkeep. Milestones marked distances. Travel infrastructure wasn't random. Why such detail? Because roads were the arteries of empire. Armies moved on them. Messages traveled on them. Trade depended on them. Without reliable roads, Rome's massive territory would fragment. Infrastructure rules were empire preservation rules. Let's move to something subtle. Noise control. While Rome was loud, there were regulations limiting certain activities at specific times. Workshops, using heavy hammers or disruptive trades, could face restrictions in residential areas. Why? Because unrest often begins with daily irritation. In a densely populated city, constant noise could trigger conflict. Rome didn't eliminate noise, but it attempted to manage friction. And friction, if left unchecked, becomes instability. Another fascinating rule involved wills. Roman citizens had to follow strict legal procedures when creating wills. Witnesses were required. Formal language mattered. If improperly written, a will could be invalid. Why such legal rigidity? Because inheritance disputes could tear families apart. And when elite families fought, political alliances collapsed. Clear inheritance law prevented civil conflict at a micro level, which in turn prevented macro instability. Private clarity equals public order. There were also rules about freed slaves. When slaves were freed, they became freedmen, but with limitations. They owed loyalty to their former masters. They couldn't immediately enter the highest political offices. Why limit them? Because Rome needed to integrate former slaves without destabilizing hierarchy. Sudden equality could create backlash from elites. Gradual integration preserved order while allowing upward mobility. It was a controlled expansion of citizenship. Another strange rule involved foreign ambassadors. Foreign envoys entering Rome were granted specific protections, but also monitored closely. Why? Because diplomacy could conceal espionage. Rome valued intelligence gathering. Foreigners were welcomed, but watched. Security and hospitality existed side by side. Let's talk about something surprisingly humane: public baths. Bathhouses were regulated. Separate hours for men and women. Rules about behavior. Standards for cleanliness. Why regulate baths? Because they were social hubs. People conducted business there, discussed politics, shared rumors. In a place where hundreds gathered daily, hygiene and order were critical. Unregulated baths could spread disease or spark violence. Regulated baths reinforced civic life. Now consider taxation. Rome taxed provinces differently depending on stability and productivity. Why flexible taxation? Because squeezing a struggling province too hard could provoke rebellion. Smart taxation maintained loyalty. Rome didn't just conquer. It calculated. There were also rules about who could form associations or clubs. Large gatherings required approval. Why restrict clubs? Because secret societies could become political threats. Organized groups meant organized power, and Rome feared organized opposition. Even social clubs were viewed through a lens of security. And finally, let's consider something deeply symbolic: the lictors. High-ranking officials were accompanied by lictors carrying fasces, bundles of rods with an axe. These weren't decorative. They symbolized authority and the power to punish. There were strict rules about how many lictors an official could have. Why regulate even symbols of power? Because visual hierarchy had to be precise. Too many attendants signaled excessive power. Too few signaled weakness. Rome calibrated perception carefully. Authority wasn't just exercised. It was displayed in measured quantities. By now, something extraordinary should stand out. Ancient Rome regulated reputation, elections, memory, grief, military loyalty, infrastructure, noise, inheritance, social mobility, diplomacy, public hygiene, taxation, associations, symbols. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was purely decorative. Every strange rule existed because Rome had encountered a crisis and responded with structure. When generals grew too powerful, boundaries were enforced. When families declined, marriage laws appeared. When buildings burned, codes were written. When corruption rose, elections were regulated. When unrest simmered, festivals released pressure. Rome was reactive, but strategic. It learned from disaster. It turned problems into policy. And that is perhaps the most fascinating thing of all. Ancient Rome wasn't strange because it was irrational. It was strange because it was relentlessly practical. It understood a brutal truth. Large civilizations don't collapse from one massive blow. They collapse from small failures left unregulated. So Rome regulated everything, even things that feel absurd to us now. And in doing so, it built an empire that shaped the world for centuries. Now we move into an even more revealing layer of Roman life. The rules that govern daily behavior so closely that they almost feel obsessive. Because by this point, one thing is undeniable. Ancient Rome believed that small cracks lead to massive collapses. And so it tried to seal every crack before it widened. Let's begin with something that sounds surprisingly familiar: price controls. In the 3rd century, during a period of economic crisis, inflation was spiraling out of control. Soldiers needed higher pay. Currency was being debased. Prices for food and goods were rising rapidly. So Emperor Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices. This law set price limits on hundreds of goods and services across the empire, from wheat and meat to clothing, labor wages, and transportation. The penalties for overcharging? Severe. In some cases, death. Why would Rome attempt something so extreme? Because economic chaos threatens political stability faster than almost anything else. When food becomes unaffordable, riots begin. When wages lose value, loyalty weakens. Diocletian believed strict price caps could stabilize markets and protect ordinary citizens. Did it fully work? Not entirely. Black markets emerge, but the intention reveals something important. Rome understood that unchecked inflation could destroy an empire from within. It wasn't just about money, it was about preventing desperation. Now let's look at something deeply symbolic: coin imagery. Roman coins were heavily regulated. The emperor's face appeared on them. Political messages were engraved. Victories were celebrated in metal. Why control coins so carefully? Because coins traveled everywhere. From Britain to Egypt, they were miniature propaganda machines. Every transaction reinforced authority. The message was subtle but constant. The emperor provides stability. The emperor guarantees value. Even currency was a psychological tool. Another strange Roman rule involved professional guilds. By the late empire, certain professions became hereditary. If your father was a baker, you might be required to become a baker. If your family worked in shipbuilding, you could be legally bound to it. Why restrict career freedom? Because essential services had to continue. Rome depended on reliable grain distribution, military supply chains, and tax collection. If too many workers left critical trades, cities would starve. So professions became obligations. Personal freedom shrank, but administrative stability increased. In times of crisis, Rome prioritized survival over flexibility. Let's talk about public executions. Executions in Rome were often staged in arenas. This seems brutal, and it was. But why make punishment public? Because deterrence works best when visible. Rome believed that watching consequences would discourage crime. Punishment was not just justice. It was theater, and theater shapes behavior. In a massive city, law enforcement relied as much on spectacle as on policing. There were also detailed laws about manumission, the freeing of slaves. Masters couldn't always free slaves freely. Age restrictions existed. Limits were placed on how many slaves could be freed at once. Why regulate generosity? Because sudden mass manumissions could disrupt labor systems. Slavery was deeply embedded in the Roman economy. Too many freed individuals entering citizenship at once could strain resources or shift political balance. So even freedom was managed carefully. Rome expanded rights slowly, strategically. Another unusual rule involved river usage. The Tiber River was heavily regulated. Docking spaces, shipping lanes, and water rights were controlled. Why? Because rivers were economic lifelines. Unregulated docking could block trade. Unmonitored shipments could hide contraband or tax evasion. Control of waterways meant control of commerce. Now consider something small but revealing: hairstyles. In certain periods, elite women's hairstyles became extremely elaborate. Some moral reformers criticized these trends. Under leaders like Augustus, there were efforts to encourage simpler traditional styles. Why care about hair? Because appearance reflected values. Extravagant fashion symbolized luxury and moral decline in the eyes of traditionalists. Rome constantly feared cultural softness. It believed external excess reflected internal weakness. And weakness threatened military dominance. Another strange rule involved nighttime lighting. Open flames inside buildings were regulated. Oil lamps had to be used carefully. Why? Because Rome was highly flammable. With dense insulae and narrow streets, one unattended flame could destroy entire districts. Fire regulations were life-or-death policies. After catastrophic blazes, reforms became stricter. Safety wasn't optional. Let's move to something deeply political: succession. Roman emperors rarely relied purely on biological inheritance. Adoption became a powerful tool. Emperors like Trajan and Hadrian were adopted successors. Why adopt instead of rely only on sons? Because competence mattered more than bloodline, at least during certain periods. Adoption allowed a ruler to choose a capable successor. It was a strategic solution to succession crises. Without clear succession rules, civil wars erupted. Adoption created stability where genetics might fail. There were also regulations about military retirement. Soldiers who completed service received land or financial rewards. Why formalize this? Because long-term loyalty depends on post-service security. A soldier who knows his future is secure fights differently. Rome institutionalized veteran benefits long before modern states. It tied military service to economic reward, and that strengthened the army. Even sanitation was regulated. Public latrines were communal but maintained. Aqueduct inspectors monitored flow. Sewers like the Cloaca Maxima were engineered and preserved. Why so much attention to waste? Because disease destroys populations quietly. Rome didn't understand germ theory, but it understood that clean water and waste removal reduced sickness. Public health meant economic productivity. There were also strict military camp layouts. Every Roman camp followed a standardized grid pattern. Why identical layouts? Because familiarity saves lives. A soldier could enter any camp in the empire and know exactly where the commander's tent was located. Standardization reduced confusion during emergencies. Efficiency was survival. Now step back again. We've seen rules about prices, coins, professions, punishments, freedom, waterways, fashion, fire safety, succession, veteran benefits, sanitation, camp design. What does this reveal? Rome wasn't improvising empire. It was systematizing it. It understood that massive territory requires predictable structure. When predictability disappears, fear rises. When fear rises, rebellion spreads. So Rome built predictability into everything, even daily routine, even careers, even death, even memory. And here's the deeper truth emerging. Many of Rome's strangest rules appeared during crisis, after war, after famine, after fire, after corruption, after rebellion. Rome responded to disaster with regulation. It did not rely on hope. It wrote laws, sometimes harsh, sometimes invasive, sometimes morally troubling, but almost always practical. The empire's longevity wasn't accidental. It was engineered through relentless control. And yet, despite all this structure, Rome still eventually declined, which raises a powerful question. Can rules prevent collapse forever? Or do they only delay it? Now we arrive at the final layer of Rome's strange but purposeful rules. The ones that show both the brilliance of Roman control and the limits of it. Because by this point, a clear pattern has emerged. Ancient Rome tried to regulate everything: power, morality, money, identity, religion, memory, infrastructure, family, ambition. And yet, even with all of that structure, Rome eventually transformed, fractured, and changed beyond recognition. So what were the final rules that reveal both its genius and its vulnerability? Let's go deeper. One of the most fascinating late Roman rules involved social class becoming legally fixed. In the later empire, especially under emperors like Constantine the Great, professions and social ranks became increasingly hereditary. If you were born into a curial family, local city officials, you were legally obligated to serve in that administrative role. If you were a farmer tied to imperial land, you could not simply leave. Mobility was restricted. Why? Because the empire was under pressure. External invasions were increasing. Tax collection was weakening. Local elites were trying to escape civic responsibilities to avoid financial burdens. Rome faced a problem. People with resources were avoiding duty. So the state locked them into their roles. It was a desperate attempt to preserve administrative structure. Freedom shrank. Stability became forced. This was Rome trying to freeze society in place to stop decline. But rigidity can also create resentment. Now consider religious transformation. Early Rome tolerated many gods and foreign cults, as long as they did not threaten order. But eventually, under Constantine the Great and later rulers, Christianity moved from persecuted minority to state-supported religion. Then, under Theodosius I, pagan practices were increasingly restricted. Why regulate belief so tightly? Because religion had always been tied to unity. In earlier centuries, shared rituals reinforced shared identity. But as Christianity spread rapidly, Rome faced a new reality. Either suppress it, which had failed, or integrate it. By aligning imperial authority with Christianity, the state attempted to redirect spiritual loyalty toward imperial stability. Religion was never just spiritual in Rome. It was political glue. When that glue changed, the structure of society changed with it. Let's talk about military reforms. Under Diocletian and later rulers, the army was reorganized. Mobile field armies were created alongside border troops. Recruitment increasingly relied on non-Roman peoples. Why? Because the empire was vast and stretched thin. The old model of expansion had shifted to defense. Rome no longer conquered endlessly. It defended. Rules changed to reflect this reality, but this also meant identity was shifting. When large numbers of non-Italian soldiers entered the ranks, Rome became more diverse, but also more fragile if loyalty faltered. The rules were practical, but they reflected a world no longer unified in the old way. Another revealing rule involved taxation, becoming more systematic and heavier. The later empire conducted detailed censuses. Land, livestock, productivity. Everything was measured. Why such precision? Because the state needed predictable revenue to pay soldiers and administrators. The empire had grown bureaucratic. Complex administration required complex taxation, but heavy taxes burdened citizens. And when citizens feel squeezed, they look for escape, sometimes to local strongmen, sometimes to invaders promising relief. The very rules designed to hold the empire together could strain it. There were also strict laws against leaving certain lands. Peasants tied to estates could not freely relocate. Why restrict movement? Because abandoned farmland meant reduced tax revenue and food supply. If too many farmers fled hardship, the system collapsed. So Rome legally attached people to land. Was early serfdom taking shape? Again, the intention was survival. But enforced immobility can suffocate innovation. Even clothing laws evolved. In the later empire, specific styles distinguished officials, soldiers, clergy, and civilians more sharply than before. Why increase visual separation? Because unity was weakening. When shared identity fades, symbols become more important. Rome tried to reinforce hierarchy visually as internal cohesion weakened. Let's look at something subtle but powerful: legal centralization. Earlier Rome relied heavily on local customs across provinces. But over time, imperial law became more standardized. Why? Because inconsistent law creates fragmentation. If provinces operate under wildly different systems, loyalty weakens. Central law reinforced imperial authority. It was efficient. But it also reduced local autonomy. And when autonomy shrinks, resistance can grow. Now step back. Across all these rules, from early republic to late empire, we see something extraordinary. Rome constantly adapted its regulations in response to crisis. War, regulate generals. Inflation, cap prices. Moral panic, enforce family laws. Rebellion, control assemblies. Urban fires, enforce building codes. Administrative collapse, freeze professions. Religious shifts, redefine state faith. Rome was never passive. It was reactive and strategic. But here is the deeper truth. Rules can slow decline. They can stabilize chaos. They can extend survival. But they cannot eliminate change. The very systems that made Rome powerful, hierarchy, control, discipline, bureaucracy, eventually became heavy. Heavy systems move slowly. And when the world changes quickly, slow systems struggle. By the 5th century in the West, external invasions, economic strain, and internal fragmentation converged. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE. But notice something important. Rome did not collapse because it lacked rules. It collapsed despite having thousands of them. Which leads to the final insight. Rules are tools. They are powerful tools. They can create order out of chaos. They can build cities, armies, and identities. But they cannot guarantee permanence. Ancient Rome's weird rules existed for very good reasons. They protected health. They preserved hierarchy. They stabilized politics. They managed economy. They controlled ambition. They reinforced identity. They responded to fear. And for centuries, they worked. Rome's longevity wasn't accidental. It was engineered through law. But even the most carefully engineered systems face limits. Because no rule can stop time. No regulation can freeze history. No empire can remain unchanged forever. And perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden inside all of Rome's strange laws. Civilization survives not because it has no problems, but because it creates rules to solve them. Rome did that better than almost anyone in the ancient world. And even today, when we write building codes, tax laws, traffic rules, citizenship policies, and public health regulations, we are doing exactly what Rome once did, trying to prevent collapse, trying to manage complexity, trying to turn chaos into order. And centuries from now, people may look back at our rules and say, how strange, how restrictive, how unnecessary, without realizing they probably existed for very good reasons. Now we reach the final layer, not just of Rome's strange rules, but of what those rules really meant. Because after exploring laws about marriage, clothing, funerals, generals, food prices, professions, religion, taxation, and even memory itself, one thing becomes undeniable. Ancient Rome did not accidentally become powerful. It regulated its way to power. And more importantly, it regulated its way to survival. But here's the deeper question. What do all these weird Roman rules actually reveal about Rome itself? First, they reveal fear, not cowardice. Strategic fear. Rome feared chaos more than it feared cruelty. It feared disorder more than it feared restriction. It feared internal collapse more than external invasion. When Rome limited how much gold a woman could wear, it wasn't about fashion. When it controlled funeral rituals, it wasn't about grief. When it banned generals from entering the city with armies, it wasn't paranoia. When it taxed urine under Vespasian, it wasn't absurdity. When Diocletian fixed prices, when Augustus criminalized adultery, when Constantine the Great reshaped religious authority, each strange rule was a reaction, a response to crisis, a defensive move. Rome was constantly patching cracks before they widened. Second, these rules reveal obsession with hierarchy. Rome believed society functioned best when everyone knew their place. Senators in front rows, citizens in togas, slaves visibly marked, widows in mourning attire, generals limited by tradition. Even triumphs were temporary. Status was not just social, it was visual. Visible hierarchy prevented confusion. And in a city of over 1 million people, confusion could turn violent quickly. Rome's social order was rigid because its population was enormous and diverse. Without structure, fragmentation was inevitable. Third, these laws reveal something surprisingly modern. Rome understood branding, purple dye reserved for emperors, faces stamped onto coins, fasces carried by lictors, triumphal processions carefully staged, memory erased through damnatio memoria. Control the image, control the story, control the symbols. Modern states still do this. Through flags, currency, uniforms, ceremonies. Rome simply did it first at massive scale. Fourth, Rome understood infrastructure as destiny. Road regulations, aqueduct monitoring, building codes after the fire of Nero, standardized military camps, grain distribution systems. These weren't just conveniences. They were survival systems. Rome lasted centuries because it invested in physical structure as much as legal structure. An empire without roads fragment. An empire without water collapses. An empire without predictable grain supply riots. Rome solved these problems with rules. Fifth, and perhaps most revealing, Rome believed morality was political. This is something modern societies often separate. For Rome, family stability, sexual conduct, public dignity, and religious devotion were not private matters. They were state matters. When Augustus enforced marriage laws, he wasn't playing moral police for personal reasons. He believed declining birth rates among elites threatened Rome's future leadership class. When censors punished luxury or dishonor, they weren't simply conservative. They believed moral weakness led to military weakness. Right or wrong, that connection shaped Roman law for centuries. But here's the final and most important truth. For all its rules, Rome still changed. The Republic became an empire. The empire split east and west. The Western Empire fell in 476 CE. The Eastern Empire continued for nearly another 1,000 years. If rules were enough, Rome would have lasted forever. But rules are not shields against time. They are tools against instability. And tools must constantly adapt. When adaptation slows, rigidity increases. When rigidity increases, pressure builds. And when pressure builds without release, cracks form anyway. Rome's story teaches something deeply powerful. Civilizations do not fall because they have too many rules. They fall when rules stop solving the right problems. Early Roman laws addressed immediate crises: war, famine, corruption, fire, rebellion. They were practical and reactive. But later, as complexity increased, the system became heavier. More bureaucracy, more taxation, more restrictions, less flexibility. And flexibility is crucial in a changing world. Rome mastered control, but no empire can permanently control economics, demographics, climate shifts, migration patterns, and human ambition all at once. Eventually, external forces and internal strain converge. And yet, here is the remarkable part. Even after the Western Empire fell, Roman law survived. Roman engineering survived. Roman political concepts survived. Roman language evolved into modern Romance languages. The idea of citizenship. The idea of codified law. The idea of infrastructure as state responsibility. The idea of centralized authority balanced by legal structure. All of these outlived the empire itself, which means something extraordinary. Rome's rules were so powerful that they outlived Rome. Even today, when governments enforce building codes, regulate elections, manage currency, control public health, and standardize infrastructure, they are following patterns Rome refined 2,000 years ago. So when we look back at ancient Rome and laugh at its strange laws, the funeral restrictions, the toga requirements, the purple dye limits, the marriage penalties, the price caps, the memory erasures, the seating arrangements, the public morality enforcement, the guild restrictions, the river regulations, the military discipline, we should pause. Because behind each one was a simple question. How do you hold together millions of people who don't know each other, don't share the same background, and often don't trust each other? Rome's answer was simple. You write rules, lots of them, and you enforce them relentlessly, sometimes wisely, sometimes harshly, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes desperately, but always with one goal: prevent collapse. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson. Every strange Roman rule existed because someone, somewhere, believed that without it, things would fall apart. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they were wrong. But they never stopped trying to engineer stability. That determination is what built Rome. And that same instinct exists in every modern nation today. Because civilization is fragile. It always has been. And somewhere, right now, lawmakers are drafting rules that future generations will look at and say, how strange. Not realizing they probably existed for very good reasons.